Dear guests, welcome to our seminar titled Archives on Ukrainian History in Times of War, Ukrainian, Canadian and German Perspectives. First, a small technical announcement. The seminar today will last about 1.5 hours. At the end, there will be a Q&A section where questions from the audience will be discussed. So, if you have questions for our panelists, please write them down into the chat during the seminar. They will be read out at the end. As always, the seminar is being recorded and will be later published on the YouTube channel of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. I will post the link to the channel and our partner institutions into the chat after the announcement. The languages of the webinar are English and Ukrainian. We have a simultaneous translation going. If you want to hear the translation, please click on the icon with the globe at the right bottom of the screen. Thank you for your patience. Now I pass the word on to Guido Hausmann.
Thank you, Georgi. Welcome everybody to our webinar from my side. My name is Guido Hausmann. I'm professor at the University of Regensburg for the history of Eastern Europe and heading the Department of History at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg. We are continuing with this webinar today, the series of webinars we have initiated in the past year, Historians at War, Rethinking the Future, which the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission has initiated jointly with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and with the journal Ukraina Moderna. We have decided to continue this series of webinars, although reduce the number of webinars in this years. We want to take up with today's webinar the rising interest in the history of Ukraine, but also the challenges of doing historical studies on Ukraine in times of war. So we have 3 speakers today, and I'm sharing this webinar jointly with Natalia Khanenko-Friesen, the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and with Professor Martin Aust, who is professor of history of Eastern Europe at the University of Bonn since 2015-16, and at the same time spokesman of the Association of German Historians of Eastern Europe. And I pass over first to Martin Aust for some welcoming words, and then to Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. So please, Martin.
Yes, thank you so much, Guido. Hello and a warm welcome to everybody. My name is Martin Aust. I'm from Bonn University and serving as chairman of the Association of Historians of Eastern Europe in Germany. Our association has been outspoken in supporting historians in Ukraine. We would like to encourage colleagues in Germany to pay more attention to the study of Ukraine's past, and we are hoping that there will be new generations of undergraduate students and postdoc students in Germany who will become interested in studying Ukraine's past. This is one of the basic beliefs of our association, and for that reason, I'm really grateful that we were invited to be part of this tonight. Very much looking forward to all the presentations, and I will be happy to learn more about the actual archival situation. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Martin. And just I want to add just one word on that Gelinada Rinchenko. She's a spokesman of the Ukrainian side of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. Can't be with us today. She's also editor-in-chief of Ukraina Moderna, So apologies from her side. And now I give the word to Natalia Khanenko-Friesen, please.
Thank you, Dr. Hausmann. I am pleased to connect with everybody from Edmonton, Canada, the home base for the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which is a 11 centers strong, well-established globally leading center in Ukrainian studies. With the resumption of the war, and now with the full-scale invasion of the war, which was resumed last February, the Institute has been very active in reaching out, liaisoning, and collaborating with our partners across the world, and in Germany in particular, and in Ukraine, of course, to promote and provide as much expertise as we can on the ongoing war and the global unfolding crisis. I'm very pleased that last year we were collaborating on launching this important initiative, Historians in the War, Rethinking the Future. And this is exactly the focus of ours in this seminar as well, though today we have a very unique perspective of archivists joining us for the discussion. I think it's also upon me to introduce our speakers, and Guido, if you think it's time, I can just move on into that. We have 3 distinguished guests with us today, and I will bring the short bios of each in the order the speakers are presented on our poster. Dr. Andriy Kohut is the director of the sectoral state archives of the Ukrainian Security Service. And the archives, as we know, stores the largest collection of declassified KGB files. He has received his PhD in history from the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, his MA from Lviv-based Khanenko National University. I also am sad to report that in the year when the war was resumed, Dr. Kohut had to suspend his very prestigious and important Fulbright fellowship at Stanford University and had to return to Ukraine to join his team on what needed to be done. We also know Dr. Kohut as a very active scholar with the focus on cultural diplomacy. His interests are diverse, ranging from topics of interest ranging from Soviet deportations, communist secret services, history, memory, politics. He's an author of many publications which highlight the documents held in the archives in relationship to those topics. Our second speaker comes from Canada, and Myron Momryk, before his retirement, was a long-time project archivist in the social archives section, in the political and social heritage division, in the National Library and Archives of Canada. I know Myron had retired some time ago, but he certainly is a holder of an important institutional memory and all kinds of knowledge, which has been housed and developed in the archives. He has served on various boards, and throughout his career, he also worked in different other capacities across the archival domain, if I can say that. And I wanted also to point out that he has authored many publications, and importantly, I bring 2, which are the guides to sources for the study of Ukrainian Canadians and Polish Canadians, which had been published some time ago. And our third speaker comes from Germany, Dr. Angela Abmeier. Dr. Abmeier studied history at the Humboldt University, Berlin, and at Cambridge. She holds a PhD in contemporary German history from Humboldt University. And since 2014, she's been working in different areas in the German Federal Archives. And at the moment, she's working in the policy department of the Federal Archives. I'm very pleased to have introduced our distinguished speakers, and Guido is going back to you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And I think I immediately hand over the word to Andriy Kohut for his input to our webinar. Please, Andriy.
Thanks. Thank you for invitations. Hi to everyone. So I maybe begin from the short explanations what our archives is, what we preserve, and how we work. So if we're talking about our archives, the Archive of the Security Service of Ukraine stores the so-called former archive of the KGB of Soviet Ukraine. On September 20, 1991, on behalf of the Parliament of Ukraine, the KGB was disbanded, and its building and equipments were transferred to a newly created special structure, the National Security Service of Ukraine. In next year, in March 1922, the special service received a new name, the Security Service of Ukraine. So thus the buildings and all property owned by the KGB and also the KGB archives was transferred to the new Ukrainian Security Service. It is worth noting that it was the archive of the Republican Department of the KGB. In April 1994, the government created the State Archive of Security Service of Ukraine, and our archives, the vast majority of our archives and of our phones, were the so-called KGB archives. At the same time, in the early 90s, part of the archival files was transferred to the state archives. In total, it was 1.5 million so-called filtration files. It's mainly the filtration files for Ostarbeiters and Soviet prisoners of war who returned to the Soviet Union after the Second World War. More than 100,000 files of rehabilitated victims of the communist regime also were transferred to the state's archives. So as a result of these transfers of files, about 7 kilometers of documents or more than 200,000 archival files are now stored in our archives in Kyiv, and more than 700,000 files also stored in the regional archives of the Security Service. There are files mainly, and most of them, it's the files of repressed person, both rehabilitated and non-rehabilitated. Also, there are documents of and decisions of so-called extrajudicial bodies such as Dvoika or Troika, or Особое совещание of the period of Great Terror. The archive stores most files of these types. Next types of our files is in number as the personal files of the Soviet Secret Services employees. We also store operational files of various units, handbooks and publications of the KGB and their predecessors. Also, in addition, we have a large number of trophy documents. The largest part of them is occupied by the documents of various organizations of the Ukrainian underground movement, more than 200 volumes in total if we're talking about these trophy files of UNUPA and other organizations, mainly in the middle of 20th century, but also we preserve, if we come back to the KGB and the predecessor files, we preserve orders, instructions, we preserve statistical informations. So if we're talking about our archives, we preserve and kept whole complex of the documentations of Soviet secret services. Chronologically, archival documents cover the entire period of operation of Soviet secret services in Ukraine and in Soviet Union from 1918 to 1991. So what the consequences did the Russia invasion have for our archives? What challenges did we face, and what preliminary conclusions can we draw? Undoubtedly, the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity in the winter of 2013-2014, was a turning point for Ukraine and, of course, to our archives. In response to the successful revolution, Russia launched an intervention and invade Ukraine. After all, it has been an old Russia tradition to invade neighboring countries to suppress revolutions since Tsarist time. So it's nothing new for us, unfortunately, but if we try to analyze the situation and the Russia war against Ukraine, now we can, the Russia invasion can be divided for two stages. The first lasted from February 2014 to February 2022, and the second started in February last year and is still ongoing. The archive of security service in Crimea was almost wholly immediately occupied. Unfortunately, they did not have time to the possibility to evacuate the archives until the last few believed that Russia could occupy the peninsula. At the same time, since the capture of the peninsula took place without combat, the archives was not damaged. Of course, we do not have accurate information. However, we hope that the Crimea archives has been preserved in its entirety. Unfortunately, we have no information of whether he was transferred to Russia or still in Crimea. The next wave was an attempt to capture the southeast of Ukraine from Kharkiv to Odessa. However, in the spring of 2014, Russia attempts were successfully only in the south of Donetsk and Luhansk region. As well as from Crimea, evacuating archives from Donetsk and Luhansk was impossible. From the words of captured Ukrainian soldiers, we know they slept on empty archival shelves. Most likely, the archives from Donetsk and Luhansk were taken to Russia. Some of the archival materials were probably destroyed and damaged, and we have some information about that, but it is still impossible to determine their exact fate. At the same time, it is worth noting that the archive in Donetsk, in terms of the number of files, was the largest among our regional units. Before 2014, most of the authorities believed that Eastern Ukraine was in the safe situation than Western Ukraine, for example, and the transfer of important and unique files and fonts from Donetsk to Kyiv practically did not happen. Only generalized information and protocols of mass repression during the Great Terror have been preserved for the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in our central archives. The situation with Crimea is a little better, also not as much as we would like. Several object files were moved from Crimea to Kyiv, its so-called Dela Formular. Such files were created against a specific object like person, organization, institutions, or even a settlement. For example, volumes about the Crimean Tatar political party Milifirka were taken from Crimea. Also, were transferred files to various so-called colonies, Italian, Greek, Turkish, etc. In addition to this file, several valuable orders and telegrams with instructions regarding the activity of the Soviet secret services also were moved from Crimea to Kyiv. It's mainly from the Holodomor time. Unfortunately, not so many archival documents have been preserved in digital copies by February 2014. Only a few dozen files were digitized from the mentioned 3 temporarily occupied regional archives. Considering the importance of the Crimean topics and the fact that most archival documents remain under occupations, our archives try to make the preserved documents as accessible as possible. For this purpose, we publish online thematic collection dedicated to Crimea. For example, the deportation and the movement of Crimean Tatars to return their homeland from 60s to 1991. Our other activity in focus on Crimea, the issue of the Crimea Tatar national movement of the early 20s of the last century, along with the documents of the Soviet special secret services, many original documents were also preserved in the forms in these files, Delo Formular on the Milifirka party. Some of these documents were considered lost. In particular, the materials of the work of the special Crimean Tatar Parliamentary Commission of 1918 were considered lost documents. This commission was created to investigate crimes committed during the first Bolshevik occupation in the winter of 1917-1918. The publication of these documents was important not only because these documents were thought to be lost, but also because this is precisely the kind of historical experience I hope we will soon have to repeat. Russia attacked on Ukraine in February 2014 had direct and indirect consequences for our archives. One of the key decisions was to start a digitization program because it makes it possible to preserve information and make it available to interested parties simultaneously. For the program of permanent digitization of archival documents was created principle for creation of these digital copies. We have identified 3 main directions to our activity in these fields. First of all, it's planned digitizations. Second one is digitization of files to answer requests to the archives. And third one, it's digitization of archival files following scientific projects, both national and international, and of course, requests of scientists and researchers. As a rule, we focused on archival requests for so-called criminal files. Most of those who contained us wanted information about their repressed relatives or neighbors. The files that we digitize according to our plan are files that contain, as a rule, generalized information or are essential for anyone who started work with the KGB archives. So, for example, the font number 16, the collection of the Secretariat is entirely digitized. And if somebody asks us to start their work in our archives, we recommend start from this collection, from the font number 16, because they contain general resume information, what happened in Soviet Ukraine. And if you find some information in these collections, it's maybe you can find more information, more files in other collections, in other fonts. However, there were also indirect consequences of the Russia war against Ukraine. One of these consequences was the adoption by the parliament in April 2015 of the so-called decommunization legislative package. One of the adopted law, and in my opinion, of course, the most important was the adoption of the law on open access to KGB archives. The law on open access to KGB archives stipulates that everyone has the right to access the KGB archives, regardless of status, profession, or citizenship. Also, all those who request information are not obliged to explain the reason for their interest. According to the legislation, the law on the protection of personal data does not apply to the archives of Soviet secret services. So we are not obliged to anonymize the documents. Everyone can read the whole documents. On February 24, 2022, I'm so sorry. On February 24, 2022, a new stage in Russia's war against Ukraine came for our archives, Ukraine, and probably not only for us. The large-scale invasion of the Moscow regime troops made it possible to extend our plan to evacuate and rescue the archival collections. We complied during the first stage of the Russia aggression would work. As our experience show, plans are not always implemented in 100%, unfortunately. However, the losses would be higher if there were no plans and preliminary work. At the moment of the full-scale invasion, as Natalia said, I was doing research at Stanford University. Of course, I had to interrupt it and come back home. After returning to Ukraine at the beginning of March, some issue had to be resolved. Some of them have not lost their relevance even today. So the key tasks and challenges we are entering minds from the last year until now. First of all, of course, it's renewing and increasing the digitization rates. Next one, it's continuation of the work of the archives as an archival institutions. The third, it's continuation of the evacuation of archival collection from east and south to the west. The fourth is rescue the documents that need restorations. And last one, it's processing the evacuated archival collections, or try to organize work with the evacuated collections in the place of evacuation. Thanks to our previous activities and extensive international cooperations, we managed to get the support of our partners. This made it possible to close some very difficult issue in the wartime. First of all, the critical issue was that the archives did not stop working as an archival institutions. Despite the fact that the reading rooms are closed in May 2022, we resumed the process of giving answer to archival requests that come to our archives. Since it is currently impossible to go to the archives and work with the documents in our reading room, we send digital copies of archival records to the requesters via internet, via online. Of course, if the requests is difficult to fulfill, either because of the volume of or the needs of to conduct a broader search, we recommend getting in touch with us after our victory. However, if we already have digital copies or the request is focused in some in some very concrete issue, we provide answers to such requests. For comparison, in 2021, we had about 4,000 requests to our archives, and last year we received more than 1,000. This is, of course, a smaller number than it was, but given the circumstances, not by much. In order to be able to carry out digitization processing and providing answer to requests, it is critically important to be able to physically access the archives, mainly to evacuated fonts and collections. Therefore, the key challenges for us was the search for archival equipment. Thanks to our colleague from Czech archives, we managed to get 4.5 kilometers of shelving equipment. So now we have already completed organizing the archive files evacuated from Kyiv and are working on the regional archives. The next important challenge is the increasing volume of digitizations. To do this, we search for resources to purchase equipment for scanning and storing digitized archives. And this support was given to us by our German colleagues. For Germany, we have support from various institutions and projects. First of all, it's from Germany, German archives through the German embassy in Kyiv. And the second is from German project coordinated by the Karl Horst Museum, and Humboldt University. Thanks to these projects, we receive equipment for scanning and saving digital data. So last years, we made twice as many copies as in 2021. And this is despite the partial evacuation and the conditions of a large-scale war. It is worth mentioning two more institutions without which this would not be possible. The Renaissance Foundations, it's institutions from the network of Soros Foundation in Ukraine, as well as the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies from the University of Alberta, who one of the co-organizers of these events. So we are kindly thank you for your support and cooperation with us. Along with renewing the digitization process and providing answer to requests, we have also identified a number of international projects on which work has been resumed. Today, there is a great demand for information about Ukraine all over the world. We are convinced that the result of international project will help to explain to the world the roots and causes of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and why Ukraine will fight until the complete liberation of our citizens and territories from yet another Russian occupations. One of the projects that we managed to complete despite the invasion was the publication of a joint work with colleagues from the Hungarian Historical Archive of the Special Services, Hungarian Special Services, about the echo of the Hungarian revolutions of 1956 in Soviet Ukraine. Now we have resumed work on project about Nazi concentration camp on territory of Ukraine. This is a joint project with the Nevzlin Center of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Furthermore, we work on a project on postal censorship of international correspondence with our Canadian partners. This is a joint project with KIUS, what I mentioned before, from University of Alberta. Also, we work on project on religious minorities. It's mainly focused on Protestant denomination under KGB surveillance. This is a project is implemented with the University College of Cork. Our cooperation with Czech colleague from the Institute for Research on Totalitarian Regimes and the Institute of National Remembrance of Poland also continues. We hope that publication about Czech aspects of the Great Terror and about Soviet deportation from Western Ukraine in 1940-41 will be published until end of this year, or maybe early in the next year. So now the key challenges we are currently working on is the creation of a digital archive or a digital reading room. Before the large-scale invasion, we periodically published collections on the website of our partner non-government organizations. Currently, over 14,000 documents from our archives are posted on this website called like a digital archives of the Ukrainian Liberation Movement. But if you're talking about Ukrainian Liberation Movement, it's in very broad understanding. So among latest collections, for example, some collections about KGB handbooks on the fighting against nationalism, and I maybe try to share the screen with this. The main problem now and what we work with this issue, firstly is the COVID epidemic and then the large-scale invasion presented us with the problem of creating our digital archives or digital reading room on a portal through which we could provide access to digitalized fonts. So now we are working on a draft project to make such an archive together with our colleague from United States and from Canada, from University of Alberta. So I hope in the very clear and near future we will find sources to realize this project and present you in the near future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andriy, for giving us such a broad overview and speaking about at the end on forms of cooperation, but also on the challenges of your archive and giving us some information on the history of the archive and how it then developed in the 1990s and 2000s. So thank you very much. And I think we'll come back to some of the topics you have raised then after the two other presentations. And I hand over now to Myron Momryk to give us some kind of some insight from the Canadian perspective. And please unmute. Please unmute.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'd like to begin very quickly to give you a sort of a word about the Library and Archives Canada here in Ottawa, where I worked for 25 years. It's a federal government institution that acquires and preserves archival records from federal government departments and archival material documenting Canadian history from Canadians. For the purpose of this webinar, I will refer to the Library and Archives Canada as the Archives. Among archival institutions in Canada, the Archives has one of the largest number of fonds documenting the Ukrainian organized community. The list of titles of fonds can be searched on the Archives webpage. Also, there are numerous files relating to Ukrainians among the federal government department records, especially immigration, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, global affairs, but I will mention archival fonds acquired from the community. From a study of the fonds acquired over the years, it is obvious that the main preoccupation is the struggle for Ukrainian statehood from 1917-21 and the aftermath. This struggle for the independence of Ukraine became the central theme in all aspects of Ukrainian organized life in Canada from 1921 until 1991, and I may add later. It was the third wave of Ukrainian immigration to Canada after the Second World War that reinforced older existing organizations, created new institutions, established newspapers, Ukrainian language schools to preserve Ukrainian language and culture, and to continue the struggle for Ukrainian statehood in the diaspora. One of the more important events in this history is the proclamation of the federal policy of multiculturalism in 1971, and I should mention that many Ukrainian Canadians campaigned and lobbied for this policy. As a result of this policy, the ethnocultural groups could benefit from federal government services, apply for grants, and the Archives established the Ethnic Archives Program in 1971. The Ukrainian Archive Program was among the more active programs that were established to document the contributions of ethnocultural groups to Canadian history. One of the first acquisitions was the Fond of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, founded in 1940, with the assistance of the Canadian federal government. As a result of sacrifices, dedication, and efforts of community leaders and membership, and especially the multiculturalism policy, the federal and provincial governments made grants available to the Canadian community to support a large variety of literary, educational, and cultural projects, and including archival projects. University chairs in Ukrainian studies, centers, and institutes were established across Canada. Ukrainian educational, intellectual, and political life developed beyond what was possible in Western Europe and the United States. The Ukrainian Canadians built a life in Canada that was not possible in Soviet Ukraine until 1991. With the rise of uncertain political conditions in Western Europe in the 1970s and 80s, Canada became the leading center of Ukrainian diaspora political life. Canada became the international base for the continuing struggle for Ukrainian statehood. Due to these conditions, and after some negotiations, the Ukrainian government in exile, whose activities dated back to the 1920s and headquartered in Munich, Germany, entered into an agreement to transfer their archives to Library and Archives Canada through their branch in Canada. This agreement was signed on August 20th, 1980. The purpose of this agreement was to provide a home for the archives. And since Canada had a large organized Ukrainian community, the Archives in Ottawa was considered to be an appropriate repository. Article 2 of the agreement reads, and I quote, "The material shall be the property of the Crown, provided that at some future date they could be transferred to the Archives of Ukraine, if in the opinion of the Dominion Archivist and the government in exile or its successors, a truly independent government exists in Ukraine. Any such transfers shall be discussed and agreed upon directly by the Dominion Archivist and the Chief Archivist of Independent Ukraine." This collection was organized as the Ukrainian National Government in Exile collection. Also, the Andriy collection was transferred to Ottawa from Vienna through the cooperation of the Canadian Embassy. This Andriy was very active as a political activist, an author, and a diplomat in Vienna and in Lviv. This fund included archival material relating to the history of the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party, the Ukrainian Social Democratic Workers' Party during the Russian Tsarist regime, and the history of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine from the First World War period. This is Soyuz Vyzvolenia Ukraina, a very important fund dealing with the struggle for Ukrainian statehood. Other fund acquired at that time was the Volodymyr Kubiovich fund that included archival material relating to the Ukrainian Central Committee, the only Ukrainian organization allowed to exist under Nazi German occupation during the Second World War. He was also involved in the production of the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, which was published in Toronto in Canada. Archival material was also acquired from Ukrainians living in Canada and abroad, including Dmitry Dontsov, Volodymyr Kiselevsky, Volodymyr Kosar, J.B. Rudnitsky, Mikhailo Yeremiev, and others. Informally, the fund from Europe are known as the Cold War Fund. The collapse of Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine in 1991 is perhaps the most important event when dealing with questions about archival relations between Canada and Ukraine. On August 22, 1992, the Ukrainian government in exile officially transferred the mandate to the Ukrainian government in Kyiv. On January 28, 1994, on the occasion of a visit of a delegation from the main archival administration under the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine to the archives, it was formally agreed that the Government and Exile Fund would be transferred to Ukraine. The Canadian-related section of the collection was organized and microfilmed in order to retain historical information concerning the activities of the Government and Exile Auxiliary in Canada. The fund was sent to Ukraine in 1996. I'm mentioning this particular event to describe how the Library and Archives Canada assisted in the preservation of archival fund relating to Ukraine before 1991. Since 1991, a number of Ukrainian archival funds from Canada were sent by private individuals to Ukraine. The Ulas Samchuk Fund and more recently the Shulgin Family Fund were sent to archival institutions in Ukraine. The Shulgin Family Fund contained correspondence from the Ukrainian government in exile headquartered in Paris to the League of Nations about the Soviet occupation of Ukraine. Among the most beneficial contacts with the archives in Ukraine at that time was the research done by Irina Matyash, who visited federal, provincial, university, and community archives across Canada and produced the Archivna Ukrainaka в Канаді Довідник, published by the Kyiv Press. This is the Center for Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. This reference book is a joint publication of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the State Committee for Archives of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian Scholarly Research Institute of Archival Science and Documentation. Now, this is a brief summary of the activities in the Ukrainian archival community since 2014 and February 2022 relating to archives and the war. I will begin with the Oseredok, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center in Winnipeg. Oseredok is one of the oldest community archives in Canada and claims that, and I quote, "it is the largest Ukrainian cultural institution of its kind in Canada." The following information was provided by Olesya Slobodna, curator of collections at Oseredok, and I quote, "Oseredok did not make any agreement with Ukrainian archives. However, last year, we announced on our media platforms and amongst our research community that we were willing to accept digital material from Ukrainian researchers for the duration of the war. We guarantee restricted access to these materials. We also contacted UNESCO and volunteered to help Ukrainian memory and heritage institutions. They included us in their volunteer list. The Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center in Toronto, and I quote from the center's homepage, "The center is a community institution which collects, catalogs, and preserves material documenting the history, culture, and contributions of Ukrainians throughout the world. The center functions as a resource center which holds oral histories in audio and visual formats many digitized and textual and photographic records. I should mention that some of the main areas of interest are the Holodomor, the Second World War, and displaced persons. The center's project is called Canada Reacts, Canada Supports, documenting the response to the invasion of Ukraine 2022-2023. And I quote, "Please send us your photos, videos, articles, and other materials on how you or your organizations have supported the Ukraine and its peoples in the time of war." The center will collect and archive your submissions to ensure that these historical events are preserved for future generations. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. A few projects initiated by the Institute are described on their webpage. The Ukrainian Archives Rescue Team offers free digital storage to Ukrainian scholars and institutions under threat. KIOS provides free, secure, and private data backup for archival institutions, research institutions, and individual scholars in all disciplines. The Canadian Emergency Response Initiative is coordinated by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the Cool Folklore Center, the Cool Institute for Advanced Studies, University of Alberta, and is supported by a number of national stakeholders. A related project is Ukrainian Displaced Persons in Canada, post-2022, Making Home in Time of Peace and War, oral history project on the experience of Ukrainian displaced persons in Canada. Natalie may wish to add more information on this. I'd like to mention the Canada-Ukraine Archival Agreement between the State Archive Service of Ukraine and the Galt Museum and Archives in Lethbridge, Alberta. This is based on information from the State Archive Service of Ukraine, and I quote, "Anatoly Khromov, the head of State Archive Service of Ukraine, contacted the Embassy of Ukraine in Canada in 2021 with a proposal to provide assistance in initiating negotiations with specialized institutions of Canada regarding the establishment of bilateral interdepartmental cooperation in the archival field. The result of the negotiations is the signing of a memorandum of understanding with the Galt Museum Archive Canada. On August 12, 2021, Anatoly Khromov and the General Director of the Galt Museum Archives signed an online memorandum of understanding. This is the first document of an interagency nature on cooperation with a specialized Canadian institution, the purpose of which is to promote better integration of Ukraine into the international archival community. The press release concludes, "We hope that the next document to be signed will be the cooperative agreement with the Library and Archives Canada." Andriy Chernyavich, Chief Archivist of the Galt Museum Archives and board member of the Association of Canadian Archivists, sent the following information. The Galt Museum and Archives in Alberta initiated the fundraiser to help rebuild Ukraine's archives, held from April to September 2022, and benefited from partnerships with the International Council of Archives and the Association of Canadian Archivists. The International Council of Archives contributed about $3,000 directly and promoted the online donation campaign. The Association of Canadian Archivists organized an online auction and collected over $6,000 for the cause. All the funds were donated to the State Archival Service of Ukraine in December 2020 and were directed towards repairing damage in some of the regional archival facilities and towards utility costs to maintain climate controls. Anatoly Khromov was consulted on the use of the funds. The Association of Canadian Archivists issued an announcement supporting this fundraiser to help rebuild Ukraine's archives on June the 6th, 2022, and I quote, "The association has launched an online silent auction to raise funds in support of our archival colleagues in Ukraine. This auction will take place during International Archives Week, June 6th to the 10th, 2022, and all funds raised will be donated to Ukrainian archival institutions after the war is over to assist in the recovery and preservation of Ukraine's documentary heritage." Another cooperative agreement project that included contribution from Canada is the Archival Summer School for Ukraine. And I quote from information from the State Archival Service of Ukraine. From June 12 to 16, 2023, just a few weeks ago, with the assistance of the State Archival Service of Ukraine and the Gold Museum Archive, educational activities were held in Budapest, Hungary, as part of the Archival Summer School for Ukraine for 8 young archivists from Ukraine. The purpose of this archival school was to acquaint Ukrainian archivists with the work of their European colleagues. The session was led by specialist instructors, Andriy and Marina Chernyavska from Canada, and specialists from Denmark and United States, and also employees from the Blinken Open Society Archives. The Blinken Archives plans to host another group of young Ukrainian archivists in 2024 as part of the Archival Summer School, which operates with the support of the International Council of Archives. The Archival Summer School for Ukraine was a partnership project between the Gold Museum and Archives, the Blinken Archives, and the State Archival Service of Ukraine, funded by a grant from the ICA.
Myron?
Now I sent.
Myron, can you come?
Yes.
Can you come to?
Yes, I will conclude very quickly. The Library and Archives Canada has been preserving important archival fonds relating to the history of Ukraine from 1980 and earlier. In a few cases, archival fonds were sent to Ukraine after 1991. It is possible that this relationship will continue. Since 2014, individual archivists and organizations in Canada have initiated projects to preserve digital archives from Ukraine. Also, there are fundraising campaigns to assist archival institutions in Ukraine. The ICA suggests that using an existing channel to financially support our Ukrainian colleagues is the most effective way to have a direct impact on rebuilding Ukrainian archival capacity. But there are numerous fundraising campaigns for many causes, including the Ukrainian military among the Canadian population. As suggested earlier, more adequate assistance to the archives in Ukraine can be provided at the government level, and this campaign should be one of the main tasks of the archival community in Ukraine and in Canada. And I would like to thank Andriy for information in preparing this note.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much, Myron, also for this broad overview and summarizing it at the end and speaking on the main tasks and challenges of current archival work and archival cooperation between the various archives in Canada. And you talked about the community archives and then on Ottawa, and also speaking in the first part of your presentation on the political relevance of the archival holdings and archival materials in Canada. Thank you very much. And I think we'll come back to that in a minute when
Sure, thank you.
Come back to the questions, come back with questions. Thank you very much. And now I give the word to Angela Abmeier.
Yeah, thank you very much. As the National Archives, the Federal Archive preserve records at a central government level. That means that we collect documents, pictures, films, cards, maps, etc. from various ministries, the Federal Chancellery, and the Office of the Federal President, among others, and make them available to the interested public and researchers. This applies to civilian as well as military records. In addition to some older documents, the Federal Archives holdings begin with the founding of the German Reich in 1871. Hence, it preserves records from the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, from the period of the National Socialism, as well as the GDR and the Federal Republic. Most of these records originated in German authorities. This means that there are no Ukrainian documents in the holdings of the Federal Archives, but there are records relating to Ukraine. These can be found in many different holdings, but especially in some originated during the Second World War after the German invasion in Ukraine in 1941. In particular, I want to highlight the holdings of the Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, the Reichsministerium für die besetzten Ostgebiete. Despite considerable losses due to the war, the collection provides a good insight into the administration of the occupied Eastern territories and Rosenberg's political goals for shaping the Eastern region. It shows the different ideas and methods in the planning and implementation of Eastern policy as they came into light in sharp contrasts with the ministry itself, with the subordinate vice commissioners, and in the relationship between Rosenberg, Himmler, and Bormann. This collection also includes the so-called Stump village reports, the Stumpsche Dorfberichte, mostly dating from 1942. These are reports on the history and current state of the villages and areas in Ukraine inhabited by ethnic German settlers. These include reports on individual villages, sketches of maps of the surrounding area, CVs of teachers, list of inhabitants with their ages, and list of farm owners, but also of those who died in starvation or were murdered. Despite all the source criticism that is of course necessary here, they offer a rich source on everyday history, but especially on the Holodomor. The Federal Archive are intensifying the digitization of central holdings from the Nazi era. This applies to both civilian and military records. Central holdings should be digitally usable by 2027. The Federal Archives are endeavoring to respond to requests from their users for the digitization of certain files. The Stump village reports have already been fully digitized several years ago and are freely available to users everywhere and at any time. The digitized records are also handed over to the head of the National Archive Service of Ukraine in 2018. In addition to the holdings of the Federal Archives, those of the Political Archive of the Federal Foreign Office should also be mentioned in our context. Here, the documents of the Federal Foreign Office and the German embassies, including the one in Kiev, are preserved and made accessible. We come to the second question about the cooperation to protect the Ukraine archival materials. In the weeks that followed the Russian invasion, it quickly became obvious that cultural institutions in Ukraine needed help to protect their facilities from bombing and artillery fire. Employees of museums, libraries, and archives were fighting a desperate battle to save the cultural property entrusted to them. Top priority was given to packing material in order to be able to evacuate the cultural assets, and as a first and important protection in case of fire or extinguishing water damage. In Germany, but also in many other countries, numerous initiatives arose that brought relief to Ukraine on their own initiative and at their own expense. Naturally, large institutions found it more difficult to provide immediate aid, but the Federal Archives also made preparation at an early stage in order to be able to respond to concrete requests from Ukrainian archives. Partnerships and cooperation from the pre-war period linked the Federal Archives in particular to the Central State Archives and the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. First, however, the budgetary requirements had to be clarified and transportation routes to Ukraine had to be found, which were difficult to organize, especially in the first weeks and months of the war. In this situation, the Federal Archives benefited from the cooperation with the Polish Pilecki Institute. Both organizations jointly sought ways to support archives in Ukraine. Regular budget funds were not initially available for this purpose. However, it was possible to a limited extent for the Federal Archives to make its own existing materials available free of charge. Among other things, folding boxes, protective clothing, and an emergency generator were taken from the Central Emergency Storage Facility of the Federal Archives in Berlin, where materials and equipment are kept for an accident or emergency in the Federal Archives itself. Several thousand archive boxes were also donated. Finally, scanners that had been discarded shortly before were also included in the aid donated. Finally, scanners the transport of the relief supplies organized by the Pilecki Institute was carried out by volunteers from the Ukrainian church community. The donations were transported to Lviv, where they were received by the Heritage Emergency Response Initiative and taken to archives in different cities. The first weeks of chaos were followed by the establishment of professional and sustainable structures. The cultural property rescuers, the Kulturgutretter, based at the German Archaeological Institute, established a structure with Blue Shield Deutschland e.V., the German Society for the Protection of Cultural Property, die Deutsche Gesellschaft für Kulturgutschutz, DGKS, the Silk Sicherheitsleitfaden Kulturgut-Team, and the German Federal Agency for Technical Relief, the THW, to get relief materials to Ukraine. The regional collection centers in Munich, Stuttgart, Cologne, Halle, Weimar, Dresden, and Berlin are looked after by the local emergency associations. The Federal Archive participated in the locations in Berlin and Halle and supported the emergency associations with personnel and equipment. The Federal Archives used this vote for 2 aid deliveries. It bought 4 used but overhauled archive scanners. The scanners were delivered to the State Archive Administration in Kiev by the Ukraine Art Aid Center. In December 2022, the delivery of 20 fireproofed armored cabinets to the State Archive Administration of Ukraine was initiated following a request for assistance. The delivery was organized by the Ukraine Art Center. The technical support was provided by the Federal Archives, together with the General Directorate of the State Archives of Bavaria, and the delivery was financed from the special funds of the German Federal Commissioner for Culture and Media, the BKM. While in the first year of the war, the priority was particular to supply the materials of the protection of archival property and for digitization. In 2023, the Federal Archives are providing support in particular through training courses for Ukraine archivists on preservation issues, by providing a forum for the Ukrainian situation at the meeting of the European Board of National Archivists for or the International Conference on Preservation Issues, which met yesterday and today, or by inviting Ukrainian archivists to Germany for lectures and joint exchanges together with the Pilecki Institute. All state archives with which the Federal Archives and the Pilecki Institute have been in contact have begun digitizing records. Today, the protection of cultural assets always means digitization in order to at least digitally secure the cultural asset with the physical, when the physical preservation of the originals seems uncertain. At all locations, the State Archives intensified their digitization efforts during the war in order to digitally protect the archive materials against a total loss of information. Digitization equipment, especially scanners and laptops, but also storage systems and servers, are therefore now at the top of the Ukrainian archives list of requirements. In delivering scanners, the German Federal Archives hope they could support the crucial work of the Ukrainian colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela Abmeier, for your overview and talking about the materials in the Federal Archives of Germany related to Ukraine, as you have termed it, in particularly during World War II, which is, of course, a time period of kind of major holdings of materials on Ukraine. But also then speaking in the second part of your presentation on cooperation with Ukrainian archives to protect the Ukrainian archives. So thank you very much for this. So we have, I think, 3 wonderful inputs on the archival situations in Ukraine, in Canada, and in Germany, so related to Ukrainian history. And there are a number of questions already in the chat. And if Martin, if you, or if Natalia, if you would not like to start with questions to our panelists, then I would probably immediately move forward and take up 2 or 3 questions off the chat. Is this okay with you?
Yes, absolutely. I've looked at the questions in the chat, and these are really interesting questions. You should relate these questions to the panelists, I think.
There are a few questions which are directly related to the KGB archive in Ukraine. And of course, I mean, junior researchers or senior researchers with interest in Ukrainian history, they are asking about, you know, certain topics and materials. If there are kind of any materials in the KGB archive in Ukraine, and I just take up 2 of these questions in the chat. One is on musical immigration into Ukraine in the 1930s, mostly from Germany and Austria. Does the KGB archive contain any documents on this topic? Or another question is on the question on surveys or reports done by KGB experts for Republican or Union institutions on the performance of economic sectors like agriculture or metallurgy by Max Trecker. Would you like to comment on this, Andriy, Kohut?
Mainly, maybe very briefly, because it's very concrete questions about some topics. So if we're talking about, for example, 30 and the level of preservation of archival documents from the pre-war, mainly before the Second World War times, so these documents preserve very well. So unfortunately, the latest documents from the 60s, 70s, 80s preserve in much more bad way, because in the end of Soviet times, the KGB tried to purge archival documents before, because they started perestroika times, and KGB tried to prepare to the new democratic world. And they destroyed mainly documents from the 90s. Its situation is very close to the Stasi archives when they tried to destroy the documents when protests arise. And unfortunately, in Soviet Union, it's not happened situation like in Eastern Germany, when the protesters captured all buildings and stopped this process of destroying of archival files. So when we moving deeply to the beginning of 20th century, we can find more and more documents. So when we're talking about 30s, about some immigration from Germany and Austria, I think that these documents must be preserved in our archives. Unfortunately, in the middle of 30s, the first of all its files against some so-called German organizations. It's very broad operations against a Germany specialist, and then during the Greater War, it's also exists. It's so-called German operations. So I think that mostly the German specialists from Germany or from Austria was suspicious like some agents or spies, and unfortunately I think we can find some information about them. But you need write to us a mail, and we try to check what we have, and if we have some informations like criminal files, we create digital copies and send you these digital copies immediately when we digitize the whole files. Regarding to the situation in economy sector, so when we're talking about Soviet Union, it means that everything was the so economy not is independent from the state. Nothing not independent from the state. Economy, agriculture, metallurgy, special metallurgy was a key issue for the communist regime. So of course we have some reports how the situations was going on in these sectors, but it depends what time you want to find. It's 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or maybe something else. So depending on the chronologically frame of your interests, we can find more or less of documents, but I think that we have these documents because everything was under, so everything was like a point of interest of the state.
Thank you very much. And I have a question to Myron Momryk. So thank you very much for your overview on Canadian archives. So as far as I understand, so in Canada, the situation is that the materials are quite dispersed across the country in many archives or in various archives. Is this correct? So if I would like to do research on historical topics, related to immigration from Ukraine to Canada or to political immigration, then I would have probably to go to various archives in Canada to get the necessary information. And are there archival kind of handbooks which somehow give an overview of Ukrainian materials in Canadian archives?
Yes, actually, I mentioned earlier the work done by Irina Matyash, and
Yeah.
she published this guide, this resource, and it's a very substantial book, over 800 pages, but it's in Ukrainian. So you will have to brush up on your Ukrainian.
Yeah.
But the place for immigration and anything that deals with international aspect of, let's say, immigration, contacts between Canada and Germany, whatever, that is here in Ottawa at the Library and Archives Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And the archives are fairly well organized. They have very good finding aids, and it's accessible. We've had researchers come from the United States and European countries, and even during the Soviet years, we had some researchers coming at that time to research the archives here. So the material is here. As far as private archives are concerned, then you would have to go to probably some of the centers I mentioned, the Research Documentation Center in Toronto, especially dealing with World War II, with refugees, with the Divizia Halichina, because quite a few of their members did settle in Canada after the Second World War. The Holodomor, again, that's in Toronto, and also I would recommend Kios in Edmonton. So the material is here. Some of it is scattered into some of the university archives, community archives, but I think Irina Matyash did a very good job, and you should be able to trace some of this information through her guide.
Thank you very much, Myron. Natalia, you have a question, so please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I do come into the conversation as a cultural anthropologist and oral historian who is mostly focused on the unfolding events, and nowadays the unfolding events are as such. The war since 2014. I do have a question for Andriy, not necessarily perhaps reflecting on the archives which you are directing, but in general. Has there been a documentation and processing of the ongoing related materials deposited in the archives since 2014? And frankly, also, of course, what's going on with your archives when it comes down to the ongoing events in the war? What is being...
It's a great question, of course. I think that unfortunately from the beginning of 2014, no one archives not start collecting information about ongoing war. And of course, after the February 2022, the main priority for archivists is to preservations, archival fonts and collections what we kept at this moment. But I hope that in the future, a lot of non-government initiatives, but also some initiatives from the university and some academical institutions collect a lot of interviews and a lot of informations. And I hope that Ukrainian archival institutions will in future will be a partner for those institutions for preserving these informations. So unfortunately, before the when Anatoly Khromov mentioned by Myron, who moving from our archives to the position of the head of the archival service maybe 3 years ago. Unfortunately, only from those moments we can talk about some changes what happens in the archival systems, in archival institutions, and I hope that this pushing for archivists and for archival institutions to be more open for collaborations, not only for academical institutions, but not only for foreign institutions on some level of state, like in Canada or federal archives in Germany, but also for some civic initiatives will be moving forward. And I hope that in future Ukrainian archival institutions will be the place for preserving these archives, because one of the key issue how to preserve a lot of these materials what was collected from 2014. Some of them, for example, working. I know that Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance working on this program to collecting and preserving these informations. They create special digital application for working with these documents, but it's only one institution. Of course, it's not enough for those dozens and dozens of initiatives what exist now in Ukraine. So I hope it will be moving forward in for the future. It's very important question and issue. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
I have some additional question to that, Andriy, because I listened to an interview on the German broadcast station with some Maria Glazunova from Kiev, from the National Film Archive, Dovzhenko. And she was talking about that she is creating a war archive. So, and I think that there are numerous, probably, or several initiatives in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Can you say a few words on that?
So yes, today we have a few different initiatives organized by some NGOs, some also state institutions, because Dovzhenko Center is like a state institutions. When we talking according to law, they not archival institutions, but like a center who work with some collection what they preserves. So, but they start these initiatives, and also some. So we have a lot of these initiatives, but the main questions have to organize this preservation of this data on sustainability levels. It's like a main problem. It's sustainability for the future. When you're talking about Dovzhenko Center, unfortunately, few latest years, it's a huge discussion between Ministry of Culture and Dovzhenko Center, how they need to work in the future, what's the status, and so on, so on, so on. So I don't know how it will be moving in the future, but if we're talking about state archives, it's very important that they have this maybe minimum, but they have some support from the state budget, they have support from the government, and they will be exist in the future because like they are function to preserve the information. So of course we can criticize one or another archives because they not so quickly react to the ongoing things, not so maybe open, maybe much more reactive, but in my point of view, it's a nature of archives that they not so quick change institutions, much more looking to the backs and not to forwards. So yes, we have a lot of these initiatives, but the main problem, if they will be, if they can find some sources for their collections in future, and it's a main problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's also very important information. Thank you very much. Are there further questions? I would have one to Angela Abmeier, but Martin, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. I have a follow-up question to Myron Momryk. You were talking about the documents of the Ukrainian government in exile. And you said these documents were transferred to Ukraine after Ukrainian independence, right? And you mentioned a publication. Is that a publication of the documents, or is that a publication of a reference guide to the documents?
I think we're referring to the finding aids, what we call them here in Ottawa at the archives is a finding aid. It's a list of files, and they're identified by file and by container number.
Thank you. But these documents are not digitized yet.
No. They've been microfilmed. Yeah, unfortunately, the Library and Archives Canada digitizes, but they no longer microfilm.
Thank you.
And Natalia, please.
I actually wanted to ask Angela, I wanted to ask you questions in some similar fashion, a smaller focused question. If one is interested in accessing and researching correspondence which was exchanged between the Osteuropahistorikerinnen and their families in Ukraine, where should one go to find out such correspondence?
So they are probably only in family archives, you know. So it always it's always the question where the files were originated. So and then you have to look if you have, for example, like a ministry, then you will find it in a ministry, the ministry file still in the archives of this ministry. So in Germany, if you are on the central state level, that would be the federal archives. And if you are at the level of a province or of a city, then it will be in the Landesarchiv, like the archives of the provinces or the cities, or for example, at universities, if someone, you know, worked at a university. So so if you want to know to which archive you should go, it's always the question where the files were born, and then you can find the archives it's probably in. So it's not, sometimes there are changes, but that's, I always said that's the first question.
Thank you.
And I would have another question to Angela Abmeier. So you were mentioning the cooperation between the Federal Archive and Polish archives. So more recently in the past year. My more general point is there are there any political agreements on a more general level between Germany and Ukraine, or on the level of EU, on how to cooperate with Ukraine? Is this an issue? You know, is it a political issue?
So the cooperation I talked about, it's not a cooperation between the Polish archive and the German archive, but the Polish Pilecki Institute. That's it's an institute. We did have a cooperation. So of course we do have cooperations to the Polish archives as well, like the state archive. But in this particular moment, the cooperation between the German Federal Archives and the Pilecki Institute was really important, because the Pilecki Institute, which is a smaller institute who could that could immediately help. So, and because we had already this cooperation, we could kind of bring together what we both could provide, and so we're able to relatively quickly help. So so I'd say, at least until now, it's not really. I think we do not really need those official corporations. So of course we like cooperation on a smaller level. So we invited the head of the archives of the Ukraine archives to the board of the European. It's called the European Board of National Archivists, which took place in summer last year in Berlin. And so, but we do not really need an official corporation to do that. And so we try to do it on a much more smaller level, I'd say. But of course, on, let's say, a national level, there was financial support as well for different initiatives, and as well for us, so we could that we could do several things to help the Ukrainian archives, and as well helping people who come to Germany and that they could work in the federal archives, at least for a time. And yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question to Myron?
Are there questions?
May I ask a question
Sure.
for Myron?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Myron, I know you're out of your office for some time, but I'm sure, and I know you're quite active in the field. If Canada wants to get more substantially involved with assisting Ukraine, in particular with archiving the ongoing documents digitization, where would you say we should go as teams?
Well, I think basically I would start at the political level, because I would suggest contact maybe the Minister of Heritage, and who's responsible for the archives in Ottawa here, and go through him. Because the trouble is that, as you know, the government is sort of has, they claim they have limited resources, and the Canadian government is giving more than enough to Ukraine when it comes to military equipment and whatever. So when it comes to archives, it's usually way down the list of priorities, as it is with most organizations. It's the last thing that they worry about. But I think I would start with the political, at the political level, and mention basically that some kind of an agreement should be worked out between the archives in Canada and in Ukraine. When I was still working at the archives, there was a request submitted from the archives in Kyiv to Dr. Ian Wilson, and he did consult with me. But the problem is that the archives themselves, as a government department, cannot go out and do fundraising for something like this. The money has to come from the government, and then when the money, and then when it does come from the government, then it's a question of negotiations, budgets, annual planning, and you know yourself in an institution like that, this money is just not that readily available. So I would suggest at the political level.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we slowly come to an end of our webinar, and I would like to give the word to Andriy Kohut at the very end, because you were speaking initially on, you know, the challenges and also the various forms of cooperation your archive is kind of maintaining and is developing. So what are then, you know, if we come back to the situation of your archive, what are the main challenges for you as director of the KGB archive or SBU archive in Kiev?
Thanks. So when we're talking about digitization process, it's so if we, for example, try to look backward for a few years, and before the full-scale invasion, for example, for our archives, one of the main problem, it was equipment for digitalization, scanners, computers, and also the equipment for preservation of digital copies, like some servers, hardware, and so on. But now, few years after the helping from German side, from Canada, from Kyiv, from our other partners, the main problem is creating like a digital system to manage all these digital copies what we created during the last years. For example, now we have maybe more than 5 million of digital copies. And of course, if you create a lot of digital copies in one moment, you start thinking how to better operate and work, and of course, how to use this huge amount of digital copies for the research purpose. And now it's like from one hand, it's a problem how to manage with all this content in our archives. It's one level of problem. Another level of problem how to organize access to these digital copies via internet from our partner institutions, but also from the requester who want to work with our collections, and they know that we create a huge amount of digital copies, and they ask us about access to these digital copies. And of course, in the time of war, one of the main problem is the safety. How create the safety web source, what can be usable for everyone, and how create these applications is it's unfortunately in Ukraine. It's very not easy to create this system, not because we didn't have some specialists or some IT specialists, because we have. But the main problem is that today the focus of Ukrainian state agency mainly focused on the war issue, how to fight against the Russia invasion. And from this point of view, of course, we try to collaborate with our colleagues from the West, who have more possibility to thinking not about present day moment of Russia attack against Ukraine, but also try discuss with us how to create these collections. And if we're talking, for example, about Ukraine, now one of the main direction of the development of our statehood is the moving forward to the European Union. But if we, for example, discussing the situation in archival sphere, in European Union not exists some unique or common rules for archival systems. Every state have their own system, archival system. For example, in Czech, they have their own law. Poland has their own. Germany also have this in another situation. And if we're talking, for example, today, and Ukrainian government, when we communicate with Ukrainian government, they answer to us, so you need to start collaborations with European institutions to work accordingly to the European rules, European procedure, and so on. And for us, it's like a tricky moment, because it means that we can choose what European experience we want to work with, German, Czech, Polish, or French, or I don't know. And of course, for us, it's not bad, because we can choose a better situation in every moment. But from another side, it's also not very easy, because we cannot work with some European institutions in the level of some DG, like or some European Commission level, because we don't know to discuss with whom.
Yep.
Okay, in Germany we know we connect with whom, in Czech Republic, in Poland also. But if we're talking about this European level, for us it's not easy. But and maybe because we're looking forward mainly for Canadian university and institution like Kyiv, like University of Alberta, or we looking for some university in US like Harvard, Stanford, who work with on this field and have some expertise, and we understand that they have this some expertise, they have some vision and knowledge how to cooperate. But from other side, also in Ukraine, when change in state archival service happens few years ago, when another Chrome coming, they also start this promoting digitization of the state archives, not only in the central level, like in Kyiv, but also in the regional levels. And now we have like the next one problem what arises is that unfortunately the problem of the one scheme to digitization, one scheme to metadata, one scheme how to collaborate between different database created by different archives. So now the maybe problem so from one point of view, how to work with European experience in this our way to European Union, when this European experience is very different. And from another hands, have tried to create some common system inside Ukraine regarding to the European Union. And so now we have a lot of different experience, and one of the next issue, how we much interact and cooperate to create some common system for collaborations inside Ukraine and with our partners from abroad.
Thank you very much. I think these are excellent final words also to our webinar. I think we have discussed the question of archival materials in Ukraine and on Ukraine, in Ukraine and in Canada and in Germany on various levels. I'm very grateful to in particular to the three presenters, to Andriy Kohut in Kiev, to Myron Momryk in Ottawa, and to Angela Abmeier in Berlin. So thank you very much for your inputs and for answering the various questions which we have raised. I think also that I thank you also in the name of Natalia and of Martin. And I think this was an important webinar because there are many questions, of course. There is a rise of interest in Ukrainian history, not only in Germany, but across Europe and in Canada and in other states. So thank you very much, and wish you all the best. And I hope that we keep in touch. And we will inform you about further webinars we will have and we are about to organize. Thank you very much for today.
Thanks.